A silent encounter. The sun had just set, and the streetlights cast a soft golden glow along the quiet sidewalk. The faint hum of the evening breeze whispered through the trees as Pastor Greg walked, his footsteps steady but contemplative. He had just finished delivering a sermon about redemption and the healing power of love, his words ringing in his own ears as he reflected on the meaning behind them. He often found peace in these quiet walks, a time to clear his mind and reflect on his mission. The day had been long, filled with the energy of a full congregation, yet the pastor's mind was still buzzing. It was his calling, his duty to guide and help those in need, but there was something he had been feeling lately, a longing for something more. He had always believed in the power of community, in the importance of giving. But recently, it seemed as though there was a gap, a space where something or someone was missing. Turning a corner onto a lesser-known street, his thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. It was a rustle, a movement too slight to be the wind. Greg paused, his instincts alert. The shadows ahead were deepening as twilight settled in, but something about the stillness of the street felt off. His gaze traveled downward, and that's when he saw it. There, hunched against a brick wall, was a small figure, a girl, no older than 6 or 7, wrapped in a tattered coat that seemed too large for her fragile frame. Her head was down, and her small hands clutched her knees, as if trying to make herself smaller, less visible. She didn't move or look up as he approached, her small body hunched in on itself, as if she had retreated into a shell. Pastor Greg's heart tightened at the sight. The child's presence seemed to demand attention, but also radiated an aura of caution, an air of someone who had learned to keep their distance, someone who had been hurt before. He hesitated, unsure of the right approach, but his compassion outweighed his uncertainty. "Hello there, little one," he said softly, his voice gentle yet firm. "Are you okay?" The girl did not respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her head just enough to make brief eye contact. Her eyes were large, dark, and filled with an unsettling quietness, as though they had seen too much for someone so young. There was a hardness in them that startled him, but also a deep sadness. The fear behind her gaze was almost palpable, yet there was a sense of helplessness, as if she no longer had the energy to be afraid. Greg's heart wrenched at the sight. He knelt in front of her, making himself less intimidating, though his concern only grew as the girl didn't speak. "I'm Pastor Greg," he said kindly. "What's your name, little one?" For a moment, the girl remained silent, staring at him with an expression that could only be described as wary. Her lips trembled slightly, her eyes flicking between Greg's face and the shadows around them, as though she was uncertain whether to trust him or run away. It wasn't a lack of comprehension. Greg knew she understood him. It was more like she had learned to shut the world out, to protect herself from what might come next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she whispered, barely audible, "Nayla." Greg repeated the name, as if trying it on for size. "Neela," he said gently. "You don't need to be scared anymore. You're safe now." For the briefest moment, Neela's eyes softened, but only for a fraction of a second before she looked away, as though the weight of her world was too much to bear. Pastor Greg's heart sank. He had seen this kind of despair before, too many times and in too many places. But this time was different. This was a child, someone so small, and yet someone who had experienced so much more than a child ever should. "Are you hungry?" Greg asked, trying to offer some comfort, his voice low and non-threatening. "I can take you somewhere safe. We can get you something warm to eat." Neela didn't respond, but she didn't push him away either. She simply stared down at the ground, her small hands gripping her knees tighter as if trying to hold herself together. Greg wasn't sure if she fully understood what he was offering, but he was certain that she needed help, and fast. He stood up slowly, extending a hand toward her, gently encouraging her to take it. "Come with me," he urged softly, his voice warm and reassuring. "I'll take you somewhere safe. You don't have to be alone anymore." After a long pause, Neela finally looked up at him, her gaze lingering on his face. There was a flicker of uncertainty. And then, slowly, she reached out and placed her tiny hand in his. It was the smallest gesture, but it was everything. Pastor Greg's heart swelled with a feeling of both relief and sorrow. Relief that he could offer some comfort, and sorrow for the little girl who had been so lost for so long. He carefully guided Neela to his car, where he drove her back to his home. The silence in the car was thick, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Neela's wide eyes never left the window as she watched the passing streetlights, her gaze distant and unblinking. It was as if she was trying to make sense of the world around her, trying to understand if this sudden kindness was real, or if it was just another fleeting moment in a life full of uncertainty. When they arrived at his house, Greg led her inside, his heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. He had no idea where she had come from or why she was so withdrawn, but something told him that Neela had been through more than any child should ever have to endure. "I'm going to make you something to eat," Greg said, trying to break the tension, his voice gentle. "You can rest here, and we'll take it slow. I'll be right back, okay?" Neela didn't respond, but she followed him inside, sitting down on the couch in the living room, her small body curled up into a tight ball. It was as if the very act of sitting there drained her, as if all the energy she had left was devoted to holding herself together. Pastor Greg moved quickly, preparing a warm bowl of soup, his mind racing with questions about what had happened to her. What had she endured to end up like this? And more importantly, what could he do to help her heal? When he returned with the soup, he sat beside her on the couch, offering the bowl. Neela looked at the soup, her gaze flickering to his face before lowering to the floor once more. It was clear she didn't trust him yet, but the faintest glimmer of hope shone through her eyes as she took the bowl from his hands. Her first words, when they finally came, were simple. "Thank you." It was a whisper barely above the sound of the wind outside, but it was enough. It was the first step. And for Pastor Greg, that small, fragile thank you felt like the beginning of something much bigger, a journey that would change both of their lives forever. As she ate quietly beside him, Greg made a vow to himself. He didn't know the full story of Neela's life, but he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to help her find her voice again, to help her reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for it. Because Neela, this quiet, fragile little girl, was not just a child he had found on the street. She was someone who had been chosen to be part of his life, someone who would need his help, his love, and his faith more than anyone he had ever met. And Pastor Greg knew that whatever the future held, he would be there for her every step of the way. A new home, a new beginning. The days that followed Neela's arrival at Pastor Greg's home were both a whirlwind of emotions and a study in patience. Every day felt like a fragile thread connecting them, a slow unraveling of Neela's past and the creation of something new. Pastor Greg had seen firsthand the transformative power of love and care, but Neela's case felt different. There was a quiet resistance in her, as if she was bracing herself for the inevitable moment when it would all fall apart again. She didn't show fear in the conventional sense. Instead, there was a deep, haunting calm in her eyes, a calm born from experiences too overwhelming to process. Pastor Greg's house, nestled on the edge of the town, was a place of solace. It was quiet, peaceful, and filled with the warmth of the community Greg had worked so hard to foster. The walls, lined with books, pictures, and mementos from past sermons, seemed to whisper comfort. It wasn't much, just a modest home, but it had always been enough for him. And now it was enough for Neela too, or at least it would be if he could make her feel that way. Neela spent most of her time in the living room, sitting on the old couch near the window where the light filtered in softly each afternoon. The house was warm, and the kitchen always smelled of something comforting, either the aroma of homemade soup, freshly baked bread, or whatever meal Greg had prepared in the evenings. It was a sharp contrast to the cold, desolate night when he had first found her. The girl, however, was still a ghost, her presence faint and distant as she absorbed the rhythms of this new life, like a leaf floating on a river, unsure of where it would lead. Pastor Greg made it a point to engage her gently, speaking to her daily, offering her food and simple tasks to do around the house. Every conversation was a slow unraveling, each word exchanged a tender thread between them. It wasn't much at first. He would ask how she slept, if she wanted to help set the table, or if she was feeling okay. But slowly, something inside Neela began to stir. She started to accept the routine, to participate in small ways. At first, Neela had only spoken when absolutely necessary. She would answer Greg's questions with short, soft responses. Yes, no, sometimes a nod or shake of her head. But when he asked her about school or if she had any hobbies, she would simply look away, her eyes darkening with a sadness that seemed to settle over her like a weight. The weight of unspoken memories, of things she wasn't ready or able to share. One afternoon, after a particularly quiet breakfast, Pastor Gray had an idea. He had noticed that Neela seemed to like the few books he kept on a shelf in the corner of the living room, especially a small collection of children's stories. They were simple tales, fairy tales, adventure stories, and books about animals, all written in easy-to-read English. "Neela," Greg said one morning, his voice warm yet tentative, "would you like to read one of these books with me? Maybe start learning some new words." Neela didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at the book in his hand, her fingers trembling slightly as if she were unsure whether to accept or reject the offer. But the gentle tone in Greg's voice seemed to nudge her forward. Slowly, she reached out and took the book from him, her fingers brushing his in a brief but significant connection. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the illustrations before settling on the words beneath them. She didn't speak for a while, but Greg could see her concentrating hard, as though trying to figure out the meaning of each sentence. After a few minutes, Neela spoke, her voice quiet, hesitant, but clear. "Dog runs," she whispered, pointing to the picture of a dog chasing a ball. Greg smiled. "Yes, the dog runs. Good job, Neela." Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and for the first time, there was a spark of something more, something that might be the beginning of trust. She turned the page, slowly sounding out the next sentence. "Cat sleeps," she said, her voice growing just a bit steadier. Pastor Greg could barely contain his joy. "That's right, Neela. You're doing great." Over the next few days, they continued this ritual, reading together, sounding out words, and sometimes just enjoying the quiet of each other's company. Neela still didn't speak much, but she seemed to absorb the language, the rhythm of English, as if it were a lifeline she hadn't realized she was waiting for. With every word she learned, it felt like the walls around her, those invisible walls she had built to protect herself, were slowly beginning to crumble. But it wasn't just the books that were helping Neela. Greg noticed something else, something more personal, starting to happen. She had begun to interact with the world around her in small, subtle ways. One afternoon, Greg found her sitting at the kitchen table, coloring in a book he'd left out for her. Her concentration was intense, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully colored in the lines of a picture of a bird. The peace in that moment struck Greg deeply, reminding him of how essential this process of healing was for both of them. "Neela, that looks wonderful," Greg said softly, leaning in to see her work. "You're very good at this." Neela didn't respond, but she looked up at him briefly, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was a fleeting smile, but it was enough. Enough to tell Greg that she was starting to feel something she hadn't in a long time, maybe even joy. As the weeks passed, Neela's progress became even more noticeable. She started to speak more freely, albeit still softly and cautiously. "Please," she would say when she wanted something. "Thank you," when she accepted food or a gift. These simple words, small victories in the grand scheme of things, meant everything to Greg. It was as if Neela's voice was slowly returning to her, like a song that had been silenced for too long. Still, There were moments of silence, long stretches where Neela would retreat into herself, her eyes distant, as though remembering something painful. Greg never pushed her to talk, but he noticed the weight she carried. She would sometimes tremble when a certain word was spoken, or when a certain memory seemed to surface. But each time he was there for her, offering a hand or a comforting word. One evening, as they sat down for dinner together, Neela looked at him, really looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Greg paused, surprised by the question. He hadn't expected Neela to ask this so soon. The answer, though, was simple and profound. "I'm helping you because I believe in you," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I believe that everyone deserves a chance to start over. No matter what has happened in the past, Neela, you have a future. And I want to help you find it." Neela looked down at her plate, her fingers picking at the food absent-mindedly. She was silent for a long while, but Greg could see the wheels turning in her mind. It was as though the weight of his words was sinking in slowly, piece by piece. In the following days, Neela became more engaged. She began to ask more questions about the world around her, about Pastor Greg's life, and about the things she had missed out on. She had questions about school, about her future, about the idea of being normal. The word had never seemed to fit her, but now it was starting to take shape in her mind. She was beginning to understand that there was a world out there, a world where she could belong, where she could heal. But even as she blossomed under the gentle care Pastor Greg provided, there were signs that not everything was as it seemed. Neela's quiet moments, the fleeting glimpses of fear in her eyes, told him that there was still something she wasn't ready to reveal. And Pastor Greg knew, deep in his soul, that as Neela's story began to unfold, there would be more to discover. There would be a truth, hidden deep within her, that would shake him to his core. For now, however, he focused on the present, on the small victories that made each day a little brighter. Neela was learning to trust again. She was learning to speak. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was starting to believe that she could have a new life. A life free from fear and filled with hope. The truth beneath the silence. Days turned into weeks, and Pastor Greg's house slowly became more than just a refuge for Neela. It became a place where she could begin to rebuild, piece by piece. The quiet girl who had once been trapped in her silence now spent her days engaging more and more with the world around her. With each passing day, she seemed a little less afraid, a little more open, as though she was learning to trust again. But even as Neela began to thrive in her new life, a nagging feeling settled in Greg's chest. There was something unresolved, something unsaid that Neela carried with her. Pastor Greg had always believed that healing wasn't just about physical care. It was about understanding, about addressing the hidden hurts that no one could see. He had no way of knowing just how deep those hurts went or what exactly they entailed. But he knew one thing. Neela had been through something that had marked her in ways that words couldn't explain. One rainy afternoon, Greg found himself watching Neela from the kitchen window. She was sitting at the edge of the porch, staring out into the rain-soaked garden. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, her body still, as if she were lost in thought, her gaze distant. The air was thick with a quiet tension that Greg had learned to recognize. Neela wasn't simply daydreaming. She was processing something. There was a heaviness in her posture, a faint tremble in her hands that Greg knew had nothing to do with the cold. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, then slowly walked toward the door. He didn't want to intrude, but something inside him urged him to try. Neela had made so much progress, but she was still so closed off in certain ways. It wasn't enough for her to be physically safe and cared for. She needed more than that. She needed to feel truly heard. "Hey, Neela," Greg called gently as he stepped onto the porch, his voice carrying over the sound of the rain. Neela didn't look up at first, her gaze fixed firmly on the rain, as if it held the answers to some unspoken question. But when Greg stepped closer, she turned her head just slightly, enough for him to catch a glimpse of her face. Her expression was guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line, but there was something in her eyes that pulled at him. Something vulnerable, something raw. "Do you want to talk?" Greg asked softly, sitting down beside her on the porch. He didn't want to pressure her. He knew that pushing too hard would only make her retreat further. But he couldn't ignore the sense that she needed someone to listen, to finally hear the things she had been holding inside. Neela didn't respond right away. But the silence wasn't the kind of silence that kept people apart. It was the kind of silence that invited connection, that asked for patience. Slowly, Neela shifted, folding her legs underneath her as she turned to face Greg more fully. Her eyes, usually so full of fear or confusion, seemed to soften just a little, and for the first time in a long while, Pastor Greg saw a flicker of something that resembled hope. "I don't know how to tell you," Neela said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a vulnerable admission, a crack in the walls she had so carefully built around herself. Greg's heart tightened. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share, but if you ever want to, I'm here. You don't have to be afraid." Neela's fingers twitched nervously as she looked down at her hands, her gaze darting between the wet ground and her lap. There was a heaviness in her expression now, something deeper than the surface calm she had learned to wear. "I'm scared," she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "I'm scared that if I tell you, you won't want me anymore." Greg's chest constricted at the words. It was clear that Neela was grappling with something far bigger than she was ready to reveal, and it broke his heart to know that she felt this way, afraid to share her truth because of the possibility that someone might walk away from her. "Neela, listen to me," Greg said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You are safe here. Nothing you say will ever change that. You are not a burden, and you are not alone. I want to help you, no matter what. And I always will." For a moment, there was no response, only the sound of the rain falling steadily around them, the world seeming to pause as if waiting for something to shift. Then, as if the weight of her words were too much to hold any longer, Neela finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I was taken," she whispered, barely audible above the rain. "By people who—" She swallowed hard, her words faltering. "They hurt me. And they made me do things I didn't want to. They made me be quiet. They said if I spoke, they would hurt me more. They said I had no voice, that I was nothing." The words hit Greg like a punch to the stomach. It was a confession so raw, so painful, that he could hardly comprehend what Neela was saying. But one thing was clear. The girl he had taken in was not just a child in need of a home. She was a survivor of unimaginable trauma, a soul who had been brutalized and silenced by people who had taken away her sense of self. He sat quietly for a moment, processing her words. His heart ached for Neela, for the life she had been forced to endure. He could see now that her silence wasn't just a result of fear or isolation. It was a protective mechanism, a way to shield herself from the world that had taken so much from her. "They made me forget who I was," Neela continued, her voice hollow. "I didn't have a name. I didn't have a family. I was just their thing. And then, when I finally ran away, I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to trust. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet long enough, I could disappear. Maybe I wouldn't matter anymore." Greg's heart broke at the depth of her pain. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that she wasn't alone anymore, but he knew that words would never be enough to erase the scars she carried. Still, he couldn't help but say the one thing that felt true in his heart. "You matter, Neela," he said softly. "You matter more than you'll ever know. And whatever has happened to you, it doesn't define who you are. You are not what they made you. You are strong, you are worthy, and you are loved. I see you, Neela, and I'll always see you." Tears welled up in Neela's eyes, though she didn't let them fall. She looked up at him, her gaze searching his face, as if she were trying to discern whether he truly meant what he said. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of recognition, of understanding. Slowly, as if testing the waters of trust for the first time in her life, she whispered, You don't think I'm broken?" Greg shook his head. "Not at all. You've been through things no one should ever have to face, but that doesn't mean you're broken. It just means you've been through a storm. And storms pass, Neela. They always pass." For a long while, they sat there in the rain, the words between them hanging in the air like a fragile thread that connected their souls. In that moment, Greg understood something profound. Neela wasn't just a child who needed saving. She was a child who needed to be reminded of her worth. She needed to see that she was more than her past, that she was someone who deserved kindness, love, and a future. "I don't know how to fix everything," Greg said after a while, his voice low but steady. "But I promise you, Neela, I will never give up on you. We'll get through this together, one step at a time, and you'll find your voice again. I believe that." Neela looked at him, her eyes softening for the first time. It wasn't a smile, but it was something close, something that suggested, for the first time, that she believed it too. And so, the healing began, not all at once, not in a rush, but in quiet moments like this one. Each step forward, each whispered word, was a victory, a testament to Neela's strength and to Pastor Greg's unwavering commitment to help her find her way. But the truth she had just shared, the truth of what had happened to her, was only the beginning. There were many more layers to uncover, many more roads to travel. And as Pastor Greg held her in that moment, he knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but it would be worth it. For Neela and for him. Together, they would face whatever came next. The depths of the past. The rain continued to fall softly, a steady rhythm that seemed to mirror the fragile steps Neela had begun to take toward healing. Pastor Greg sat beside her in silence, his thoughts racing. The truth that Neela had shared with him was devastating, but it was also a beginning, a painful yet necessary revelation that would allow them to move forward. Still, Greg couldn't help but wonder just how much more Neela had buried within her. How deep did the scars go? What else was there to uncover? As the days passed, Neela seemed to retreat into herself more frequently. It was as if her confession had taken something from her, as if revealing the horrors of her past had triggered a new wave of emotional exhaustion. Greg knew it would take time, but he also understood that Neela's silence was not always a refusal to speak. It was a sign of deep inner conflict, a battle between the desire to forget and the need to confront the truth. One evening, as Greg was preparing a simple dinner in the kitchen, he overheard Neela's voice. It was quiet, almost inaudible, but there was a note of urgency in it that caught his attention. He paused, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and listened more closely. I can't remember everything," Neela said softly, her voice trembling. "But I remember their faces, their voices, and I remember the fear." Greg's heart sank. He knew she had more to share, but he also knew that pushing her too hard would cause her to retreat. So he took a deep breath, composing himself, and walked over to the living room where Neela was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. "Neela," he said gently, sitting down next to her, "you don't have to say anything more than you're ready to. But if you want to talk, I'm here." Neela didn't look at him immediately. She stared at the floor, her fingers twitching nervously, her mind clearly elsewhere. The silence hung heavy between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that invited understanding, a space where words could eventually find their way. Finally, Neela spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were people I didn't know. I was just a kid, Pastor Greg. I was taken when I was little, before I even knew what was happening. They told me that I was going to help them, that I was going to be part of something important. But then, it wasn't like what they said. It wasn't important. It was just pain." Greg's chest tightened as she spoke. The fear and confusion in her voice were evident, and it pained him to hear how deeply this girl had been scared by her experiences. She was only a child, yet she had already faced a darkness that no one should ever have to endure. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a soft, reassuring squeeze. "You're safe now, Nyla. You don't have to carry their pain anymore." Neela turned her head slightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I wish it were that easy," she murmured. "I wish I could forget." Greg's heart ached for her. He could only imagine what it must have been like for Neela, forced into a world of pain and uncertainty at such a young age. He had known that her past was traumatic, but now, hearing more about it, about the faces, the fear, the lies, he realized just how much of her life had been stolen from her. The years she had spent in silence, trying to block out the memories, had only made the pain more unbearable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of Neela's words hung heavy in the air, and Greg could feel the depth of her sorrow, the heaviness of her burden. But he also knew that this was a crucial turning point. Neela had chosen to share more of her truth, to open herself up in a way that was terrifying for her. This was progress, slow, fragile progress, but progress nonetheless. "You don't have to forget," Greg said softly. "But you don't have to carry it alone either. You're not just the sum of what's happened to you, Neela. You are more than that. You are strong, and you have the power to reclaim your life, to build a future that's yours, and I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." Neela's eyes flickered up to meet his, a hint of uncertainty in them, but also something else, something more vulnerable, more open. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I do," Greg replied firmly. "I believe in you, Nyla. I believe that no matter how dark your past has been, you can create a future that's full of light. But it won't happen overnight. It'll take time. And we'll go through it together, one step at a time." For a long while, they simply sat there, the weight of the conversation still lingering in the air. Greg knew there was so much more that Neela needed to process, so many more memories she would have to confront. But for now, in this moment, he could offer her only one thing: his presence, his support, his belief in her. The following weeks were a delicate dance between silence and revelation. Neela had become more open, sharing small details about her past in quiet, unexpected moments. There were still many things she wasn't ready to speak about, but Greg could see the gradual shift in her. She was starting to believe that she could speak again, not just in words, but in the truest sense of who she was. One afternoon, after an unusually quiet morning, Greg sat down next to Neela at the table. She had been drawing, her favorite pastime, in the months since she'd come to live with him. Her drawings were filled with swirling colors, abstract shapes, and images that seemed to speak of both beauty and pain. It was clear that art had become her way of expressing emotions she couldn't yet verbalize. "What are you drawing today?" Greg asked, leaning over to take a look. Neela hesitated for a moment, then slowly turned the sketchbook toward him. The image was raw and striking. A young girl, alone in a darkened room, surrounded by twisted shadows. But in the corner of the page, there was a small glimmer of light, a tiny, almost imperceptible sunbeam breaking through the clouds. "It's me," Neela said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "I used to feel like the shadows were all there was. But I think maybe there's a way out. Maybe." Greg studied the drawing, his heart swelling with emotion. It was a simple sketch, but it spoke volumes. Neela wasn't just creating art, she was communicating something much deeper. She was starting to see that there was hope, that even in the darkest of places, there could be light. "I think you're right," Greg said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "There's always a way out. It might be hard to see sometimes, but it's always there. You just have to keep looking for it." For the first time in a long time, Neela smiled. A small, fragile smile, but one that held so much promise. It wasn't a smile of certainty, but of possibility. The shadows in her past were still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, but they were no longer the only thing she could see. The light was beginning to break through. That night, as they sat together for dinner, Greg found himself reflecting on just how far Neela had come. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of retreat, moments when the weight of her past had seemed too much to bear. But there had also been moments of incredible progress, moments when Neela had taken a small step toward healing, toward reclaiming herself. But even as he looked at Neela, stronger, more confident, and more open than ever, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her story, something that hadn't yet been revealed. He didn't know what it was, but he could sense that the journey ahead would not be without its challenges. And though he didn't yet know the full extent of the truth, one thing was certain: whatever Neela's past had been, it was not going to define her future. She was stronger than she realized, and Pastor Greg would be there to help her uncover that strength every step of the way. For now, he could only offer his love and support, but deep down, Greg knew that the biggest battles were still to come. Neela's past was a tangled web, and there were threads that needed to be unraveled. But he also knew this: together, they would face whatever came next, and Neela would not have to face it alone. Unraveling the past, days slipped into weeks, and Neela's quiet transformation seemed to continue at its own pace, delicate but steady. Pastor Greg watched as she moved through each day with a new sense of purpose, each smile she shared with him a small victory against the darkness that had once defined her life. But with every small breakthrough, there were also the moments of hesitation, the subtle flashes of fear that reminded him how deeply she had been hurt. Neela had begun to open up about her past in fragments, sharing bits and pieces, slowly stitching together the story of what had happened to her before she came into his life. Each revelation was both heartbreaking and enlightening, giving Greg a clearer picture of the trauma she had endured. Yet the deeper they delved into her past, the more it became clear that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was one evening, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the kitchen windows, that Neela finally asked to speak about the details of her abduction. She had spent weeks in silence, her gaze occasionally flickering toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Greg had noticed the subtle shifts, her fidgeting hands, her anxious glances toward the window, but had refrained from pushing her to speak. The trust between them had grown, but there was always a part of her that remained guarded, as though her past had wrapped itself tightly around her like a cocoon she wasn't ready to emerge from. That night, though, Neela had asked him to sit with her. "I want to tell you everything," she had said, her voice quiet but resolute. Greg felt his heart beat faster. He had known this moment would come eventually, but he wasn't prepared for the gravity of it. He took a deep breath and nodded, his words soft but reassuring. "I'm ready whenever you are. You don't have to rush. We'll take it slow." They sat together at the kitchen table, the evening shadows stretching across the room, and for a long time, Neela said nothing. It was as though she were sorting through the pieces of a puzzle, deciding which ones to show and which ones to keep hidden. Pastor Greg knew the weight of her words would not come easily. He didn't expect them to. But in the silence, he could sense the walls slowly crumbling, bit by bit. Finally, Neela spoke, her voice tremulous but steady. "It was a long time ago, before I could remember anything else. I was small, just a little girl. They took me from my home, from my family. I remember the van, the people. They weren't kind. They told me I was going to be part of something bigger, that I was going to help. But it wasn't helping anyone. It was just fear. Every day was fear." Greg's heart twisted. The images she described were haunting. The memories of being taken, of being told she was part of something greater, only for it to be revealed as something twisted and sinister. He could hear the hollow weight of her words, the heaviness of the truth she had been carrying for so long. "They made me do things," Neela continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things I didn't want to do. They said that if I didn't, they would hurt me. And I was just a kid. I didn't know how to stop them. I didn't know how to fight back." Greg's throat tightened as he listened to her, his mind racing with the horrors she had faced. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but he knew that this moment was hers. It wasn't about comforting her in the usual way. It was about listening, truly listening to the truth she had kept buried for so long. "What kind of things did they make you do?" Greg asked gently, his voice laced with both compassion and fear. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the full extent of the story, but he knew that Neela needed to share it. Neela hesitated, her hands shaking as she placed them on the table. "They made me steal things. They made me learn things that I didn't want to know. They trained me, but not to help anyone. They trained me to hurt people, to break into places and take things. I was just a little girl, Pastor Greg. They told me it was a game. But it wasn't a game. It was real. It was terrifying." The words hit Greg like a hammer. He had suspected that Neela's abduction was no ordinary crime, but hearing it laid bare, hearing the terror she had lived through, the manipulation and control that had been exerted over her, it shattered him. He felt his stomach churn at the thought of a child being turned into an instrument of violence, trained to break into places and hurt people, all in the name of some twisted game. "Who were they, Neela?" Greg asked softly, his voice strained with both disbelief and concern. "Do you remember anything about them? What they looked like? Where they came from?" Neela's eyes grew distant, her gaze drifting toward the window as though searching for something just beyond reach. "I remember their faces, but not their names. There were a lot of them. Some of them wore masks. I never knew who they were or where they came from. They told me that I couldn't ask questions. I wasn't allowed to know. I think they were afraid of me asking too much. They never wanted me to know who they were, because they knew what they were doing was wrong." Greg's mind raced as he processed the fragmented pieces of Neela's story. The organization that had taken her. Who were they? What had they wanted with a young girl like Neela? His gut twisted at the thought that whatever sinister operation they had been involved in was far-reaching, and perhaps more dangerous than he could imagine. "Do you know where they are now?" Greg asked, though he feared the answer. "Are they still looking for you?" Neela's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know, but I think they are. I think they'll never stop looking for me." The fear in Neela's voice was palpable, and it sent a shiver down Greg's spine. It wasn't just the fear of being found. It was the fear of being dragged back into the life she had barely escaped. The life she had been forced to live as a child, a life that had stolen her innocence and shattered her sense of self. Greg's mind raced with possibilities. He knew that Neela's safety could no longer be taken for granted. These people, whoever they were, would stop at nothing to get her back. And if they were still looking for her, Greg had to find a way to keep her safe. "I won't let them hurt you, Neela," Greg promised, his voice full of determination. "You're safe here, and I will do whatever it takes to protect you. You're not alone anymore. You have a family now, and we will keep you safe." Neela didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to discern the truth of his words. Slowly, she nodded, her expression softening for the first time in what felt like forever. "I believe you," she whispered, "but I'm scared. I'm scared of what they'll do if they find me." Greg reached out, taking her hands in his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll figure this out together. You don't have to be scared anymore. You don't have to face this alone." But even as he spoke those words, a deep, unsettling thought settled in the back of Greg's mind. The people who had taken Neela, who had turned her into a weapon, a tool in their twisted game, were still out there somewhere. And as much as Greg wanted to believe that Neela was safe now, he knew the truth. The battle was far from over. The more Neela shared, the more Greg realized that their lives were irrevocably intertwined with a danger that was bigger than either of them could have imagined. But he also knew this. No matter what came next, he would stand by Neela. He would protect her with everything he had, even if it meant taking on the very forces that had once broken her. Together, they would face the darkness, and together, they would find a way to defeat it. The final revelation. Days had passed since that heart-wrenching conversation, and though Neela appeared more at ease, There was a new kind of tension in the air. The kind that came with knowing that the truth was only part of the battle. There were still questions, uncertainties, and most daunting of all, the lingering threat of the people who had taken her. Pastor Greg couldn't shake the sense that things were moving toward a climactic point. Something had changed in Neela. She was no longer just the quiet, frightened girl he had met months ago. She was slowly becoming someone stronger, someone who would face the darkness of her past head-on. But was she truly ready for what was to come? Neela had started to show more signs of her old self, the girl she might have been before her abduction. She smiled more often now, and there was a quiet confidence in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. She still struggled, of course. The memories and the trauma still lingered. But she was learning how to navigate them, how to live with them rather than be consumed by them. Pastor Greg was proud of her progress, but he also knew that she was not finished with the journey of healing. There were still cracks in the foundation, places where the fear still lived. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Greg and Neela sat on the back porch of their house. The trees outside were beginning to show signs of the changing season, their leaves turning golden and red, a reminder that life was constantly in motion, even in the darkest of times. They had been quiet for a while, simply enjoying the stillness of the moment, when Neela turned to him, her expression serious. "Pastor Greg," she began, her voice soft but steady, "there's something else I need to tell you." Greg felt a shiver of unease. He knew this moment had been coming, but hearing it from her directly, knowing that Neela was about to reveal more of her painful past, made his stomach tighten. He had thought that she had already shared everything, that she had told him the full extent of her suffering. But now he realized how little he truly knew. There were still pieces missing from the puzzle. "I'm listening, Neela," he said, his voice gentle but filled with concern. He wasn't sure what she was about to say, but he knew she needed to say it. Whatever it was, he would be there for her. Neela took a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was gathering the courage to continue. Her hands, which had been nervously clasped together, were now trembling slightly. It was a small sign, but it didn't escape Greg's notice. The subject she was about to broach was clearly something difficult, something that might alter everything he thought he knew. "The people who took me," Neela began, her voice faltering slightly. "They didn't just take me to hurt me. They wanted something from me. Something important." Greg frowned, leaning in slightly. "What do you mean, Neela?" Neela swallowed hard, her eyes not meeting his. "I didn't understand it at first. They kept telling me that I had a gift, that I was special, but I didn't know what that meant. Not until later." Greg's heart pounded in his chest. He had suspected that Neela's abduction was part of something much larger than just an isolated event. But now, hearing her words, he realized that the forces involved in her life were far more complicated and dangerous than he had ever imagined. "What kind of gift?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even, despite the rising tension in his chest. "What did they want from you?" Neela looked out into the distance, her gaze distant and almost haunted. "They wanted my mind," she said quietly. "They knew that I was different, that I could do things that other people couldn't. They experimented on me. They tried to unlock something within me, something that would make me more than human." The words hit Greg like a tidal wave. He had known that Neela's experience had been far from ordinary, but the reality of what she was saying, what they had done to her, shocked him to his core. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Were these people working for some kind of government organization, a private entity? What kind of experiments had they subjected her to, and why? "Neela, you don't have to share any more if it's too painful," Greg said, reaching out to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But I need to understand. You said they tried to unlock something. What did they do to you?" Neela shuddered, a brief tremor running through her body. "They tried to break my mind," she whispered. "They kept me isolated, deprived me of sleep, of food. They pushed me to my limits, and then they would show me things. Horrible things. They said it was to test my limits, to see how far I could go before I broke. They tried to make me do things that would have hurt people, things I would never have done on my own. Greg's heart clenched as Neela spoke, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. The horror she had endured was incomprehensible. No child should ever have to go through what she had experienced. He wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what had happened to her in greater detail, but something told him that pushing her too hard might only re-traumatize her. He had to tread carefully, to be the steady rock she needed. "Do you remember anything specific, Neela?" Greg asked gently, his voice a soft murmur in the heavy silence. "Anything they made you do? Anything you remember about what they wanted?" Neela looked at him then, her eyes wide and fearful, as if remembering something that she couldn't quite grasp. "There were dreams," she said softly. "I don't know if they were real, but sometimes I would wake up and I would see things, visions, like flashes of the future. I saw people getting hurt. I saw places burning. I saw them, the people who took me. And I saw myself, in the middle of it all." Greg's breath caught in his throat. "You mean you could see things before they happened? Like visions of the future?" Neela nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "Yes, and it scared me. They told me I had a gift, but it wasn't a gift. It was a curse. It felt like I could see everything happening in the world, but I couldn't stop it. I couldn't change it. They wanted to control it. They wanted to use me, Pastor Greg. They wanted to use my ability to predict things, to manipulate events, but I couldn't let them." The magnitude of what Neela was describing took Greg's breath away. He knew she had been through unimaginable suffering, but it was something else entirely. They hadn't just stolen her innocence, they had tried to make her into a weapon. They had tried to use her gift as a tool of power, a tool that could shape the course of history itself. "What happened to them?" Greg asked quietly, his voice filled with both curiosity and concern. Did they succeed?" Neela's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she seemed as though she might break. But then, as quickly as the emotion had come, it was gone. She wiped her eyes and shook her head. "No, I stopped them. I escaped. But I don't think they're done. I don't think they ever will be." Greg's mind raced. The people who had taken Neela, who had tried to break her and use her for their own ends, were they still out there? Still searching for her? Had they even realized yet that she was gone? "Neela," Greg said, his voice steady with determination, "we can't let them hurt you again. You're safe here, but we have to be smart. We need to find out more about who they are, what they want, and how we can stop them from ever hurting you or anyone else again." Neela looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered. "I want to fight back. I want to make sure they never hurt anyone again." Greg nodded, his heart swelling with admiration for her courage. "Then we'll fight together. I promise you, Neela, we will stop them. And we will make sure they can never hurt anyone again." As they sat together in the fading light of the evening, a new resolve settled over them both. Neela had faced a darkness beyond comprehension, but she had survived. And now, together, they would face the storm that was still waiting on the horizon. It wasn't going to be easy, but with each passing day, Neela was growing stronger. And with Pastor Greg by her side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The battle was far from over. But for the first time, Neela truly believed that she had a chance to take control of her own destiny, and to make sure that no one else would ever have to go through what she had endured.